Hello and welcome to day 3 of our Novena of Grace here at the Jesuit Parish of Divine Mercy. As I said on the first day, St. Francis had 2 roommates at the University of Paris. One was St. Peter Faber, and the other was St. Ignatius of Loyola. St. Peter Faber was immediately taken by Ignatius and often had long conversations about the things of God, whereas St. Francis remained quite cool to Ignatius. He wasn't interested in anything Ignatius had to say about the things of God and God's will in particular. Whereas for St. Francis, he was interested in completing his education, getting his degree, getting a good, high-paying job so that he could help restore his family's prestige and its wealth. It wasn't until one semester that St. Francis ran out of money to pay his tuition, and Ignatius offered his own tuition money, that St. Francis then began to warm up to Ignatius. Of all those first companions, we say in the Jesuits, who surrounded St. Ignatius in his days of study at the University of Paris, St. Ignatius would give to them the spiritual exercises, the long retreat. But he did it individually, not for the group, but when each person seemed ready, Ignatius would then lead them through the spiritual exercises. Of all those first companions, the one who St. Ignatius left to the end because he didn't seem ready was surprisingly St. Francis Xavier. Ignatius eventually gave the exercises to St. Francis, and that experience of the exercises completely transformed St. Francis's life. No longer was he interested or motivated by wealth or prestige. Rather, he decided to give himself completely to God and to God's service. And this little group of students at the University of Paris, they took vows together and joined in a way or formed in some way an informal group. So just imagine that for St. Francis, he had been preoccupied by prestige and wealth. And then he vowed himself within this small, unknown, unapproved group in the church. Eventually, years later, it became the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits. But in his time, it was just this small, insignificant group that had not been approved by the church. And so it was, in a way, the opposite of what had motivated him before: power and prestige and wealth. Now it was just almost anonymity, a life given over to the service of God. So today we reflect on God's will for the person. Each life is again that unique expression of the Father's love. And each life, each of us, God has a particular will for that person. And so we then try to discover, to discern what that will is. Sometimes we imagine that God's will would be spoken in a clear, direct way. Maybe like Moses, we would have that experience of the burning bush. Or maybe more familiar would be St. Paul on the road to Damascus. That we receive this concrete, direct communication of God's will. However, excluding Moses and St. Paul and perhaps a few others, for most of us, that is not the way it happens. But rather, the way it happens is through self-reflection. self-reflection of the movements of our spirit, that is, the movements of our hearts. For example, I myself, I had clearly understood what I was to do in life. That is, I understood that I wanted to go and to study law, to go and be a lawyer. And then being a lawyer, imagining or understanding, I should say, that I would then get married and have a family. And so then I remember going to law school, and God gave to me everything that I thought I wanted, everything that I thought would make me happy. And even though I had all those things, I felt within myself sort of an emptiness more than ever. It was like I was desperately trying to make something fit that could not fit. I was trying to force it. And every day I'd go for a walk. And going on those walks, I would imagine. And when I imagined these things, and they weren't based in reality, I wasn't the most religious person. But when I would imagine these things, I would feel peace. I would feel a consolation. I remember back to seeing the movie The Mission, this story based in the 18th century in South America, the Jesuits working in the reductions among the indigenous people. Remember the scene in which one of the Jesuits they had to climb up this great cliff to get to the plateau where this indigenous tribe lived. And again, I'd imagine myself climbing that cliff. So it was just sort of a fantastic image. It wasn't based in reality. I don't think I could climb a 5-foot wall, let alone a cliff. But the point is that in this fantastical image I was having, I was receiving consolation. I wouldn't have called it by that name at the time, but I was feeling peace inside. And I was feeling an enthusiasm, a generosity. And when I go back to my books for my law, for the law school, it was the opposite. Every word I had to read was a labor. I wondered what the point was. Again, I felt that lack of peace within me. I felt an instability. And so that's how we discern, if you will, God's will. There are things in which they give life to us. They make us more alive. They make us more free to love. They give us peace within our hearts. It may not be what we think we're supposed to do, or it may not be what we want to do. And yet, that is that communication by God to each person. That communication of His will. And His will is like His dream for us. That great dream in which we enjoy life and life in abundance. And so every single person, God has His will for you. And even though sometimes it may be hard for us with any certainty to know that indeed it is God's will, maybe that certainty always remains beyond us, because we are a creature and He is the creator. We are limited, He is unlimited. I remember reading once by Thomas Merton, and Thomas Merton wrote that the fact we try and discern God's will, and we try and follow God's will, even if we get it wrong, but the fact that we're trying, that this is delightful to God. It pleases God. And so St. Francis tried to make something fit that didn't fit. And then, as he reflected on the life of Christ in the spiritual exercises, he became full of life. He became full of zeal. He became full of passion. He became full of love. And he desired only to go and to share that, to go and share that gift of Jesus Christ with every person he encountered, to share that gift of Christ with the whole world. And so as we live our lives and we seek to discern God's will, it doesn't have to just be the big things, what am I to do with my whole life? So too can we apply it to the little things in life. Because God is never disinterested in any aspect of any of our lives. And so we ask then, what is God's will for this or that? We listen to our hearts. We pay attention to the movements of the Spirit within us. God will always give us life. And so we look for those signs in which we feel our hearts expanding, our participation, our joining in life in abundance. We look for those indications of peace. We look for those indications of joy, for those indications of increased generosity, of service. And that then is God's communication. It's not a voice like Moses heard, or the voice, the vision that St. Paul received, but it is still God's communication to each of you. Because for each of you, God has a will. That is, that God has a dream for each of you. And we experience that life and life in abundance, the joy of this life, the beauty of this life. And we are able to indeed live that will, to accept it, to receive it, and to embrace it. God bless, and see you tomorrow.